Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we are talking about the ethics of thirst in fandom with special guest Ashley Coffin. All that and more after commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back, folks. I'm your host, Matthew. I'm joined by regular co-host on this show, as well as a number of others I do, Star Wars and so many other things in the Stranded Panda universe. Ashley Coffin. Ashley's become named, what's your current title? The Fairy Godmother of Thirst?
Yes, I am the Fairy Godmother of Thirst.
Exactly. Well, and I think if you listen to the MCU podcast, or if you pay attention to the Stranded Panda Facebook group, or not just in those places, but in other places as well, the topic of thirst in fandom is one that's been coming up a lot, especially in terms of, the appreciation of male bodies, especially. The MCU has been heavily leaning into this in good ways. It's bringing up all kinds of questions in all sorts of different directions that have been really interesting to people. And Ashley, I know you've had so many thoughts about this that I'm really excited to hear to have you on to get talking about it.
Always just so thirsty.
Well, our hydration will be strong as well as our conversation. And I want to say as a quick note to people, first of all, we often get into topics that are fairly adult and nuanced, and I hope people can enjoy this podcast of all ages. Let's start again. And I want to start by just saying a quick note. We don't keep our language clean on this podcast. I think for the most part, this is not what we would call a family-friendly podcast, but as a teenager, I was certainly listening to a lot of things with explicit language, and I have no objection to that, but some people's parents might, and that's fine. I want to say, though, for this one, again, I'm not going to tell anybody not to listen, but I want to, for any parents or the like, or just if these are topics you're sensitive about, today we're going to be talking, quite frankly, about sexuality and attractiveness and the ways in which people express their interest and express their horniness, their thirst. Mm-hmm. That's a topic that obviously has a lot of sensitivity to it. It is a topic that is obviously controversial in a lot of places. And I think Ashley and I have a pretty, we're not going to see eye to eye in everything, but both of us are coming to it from a fairly specific place. And I want to just kind of invite people that if this is a topic you're comfortable engaging with and listening to, please feel free to do so. If this is a topic that is not necessarily your cup of tea, then we're going to have another episode out next week. And, please listen to that one. And if it's one where, Ashley and I are going to be very careful, I think, to try and talk about this in as nuanced and, really aware of the many complications of these topics as we can be. But it's also one that we're going to, have some fun with. And I hope that we're not going to, say things that cross any lines for people. But if we do, please let us know. I, as a podcast host, I'm always growing. I'm always learning. There's always ways in which I think that there are things that I can be better at. And Ashley, I'm sure you feel the same. Mm-hmm. So just kind of want to say to our folks there, whenever you got thoughts or stuff like that, please always feel free to share it, and I'll have all the contact info for that at the end. So with all those kind of things out of the way, Ashley, let me just kind of hear from you just at the very start. How are you kind of feeling about this topic and the idea of us getting into it?
It's definitely become a fun part of our community. I've liked watching other people kind of grow out of their shell and get more involved with it. It's creating a discussion and letting people, talk about the things that they fantasize about. And let's be serious, we all fantasize all day about everything. You do. You're at work, you're like, God, I know I probably do it more than other people because I'm like, I just wish I was Black Widow, doing this or that, but it is a part of it, and it's healthy and it's natural. And they put these beautiful gods on display for us for a reason. Mm-hmm. There's a reason why stars and Hollywood and all these people they're all so beautiful.
I can understand that for sure. And I definitely think you're right that fantasy is a very important part of a lot of people's lives. I think for folks who are on the A spectrum, it may be a much smaller or not a part at all, or for other reasons like that. But certainly for most of us, fantasy is a big part of things. And I think you're right. I think that obviously Hollywood is, has always been about putting beautiful people on screen. And to me, kind of the importance of this moment that we're talking about it is that, for such a long time, that has been done in a very specific gendered way of getting to enjoy the female body presented for the male gaze and through the male gaze and things like that. And as you've kind of been talking about that, more recently there's been much more of hey, let's appreciate masculine bodies as well. And also create a culture where all can do that, but especially giving women the space and feminine identified people and people, queer folks like myself, more space to appreciate masculine bodies and masculine attractiveness and things like that. And so let me just kind of start with a very basic question here. When we say thirst, I mean, I think on the internet, that's kind of it just become, it means horniness, it means being turned on. But in this kind of a contest, in this kind of a context of like fandom thirst, what does thirst mean to you?
When I think of something that makes me thirsty, it's like seeing, who can I pull out of my bank? Chris Hemsworth in Age of Ultron, when he gets into that little pool and is just dripping wet. It makes my mouth dry. It's something that makes you clutch your pearls. Like, oh, my goodness. Like, that took my breath. Like, this specimen is so gorgeous. He took my breath away, or she took my breath away.
Right. Or they took your breath away.
Mm-hmm.
And for you, you have become more and more vocal on our podcasts about that. What has that been like for you in terms of like being able to claim that space of being very, very frank about your attractiveness to these, your attraction to characters and the things that makes you feel and want to do?
It's very interesting because you get so much positive feedback from men and women and everybody, both sides, all sides of the party. And then you'll get your people who are more conservative. Is that the right word?
I think that's one possible word for it. Yeah.
Yeah, or it makes them uncomfortable for whatever personal reasons they have. And when those people, message me or us at the podcast, like, of course, like I read that and I really do take it in, and it does make me feel bad, and I understand their situation, but the others, like the positivity that comes from it is overwhelming, and it's fun and it's funny, and you're going through your day, you've had a hard day at work, we have like thirst round-offs where everybody will just post a picture and it'll keep going, and that 3 minutes of your maybe shitty work day, you get to sit there and laugh, camaraderie, and find an amazing gift of a body that you just like to look at and escape.
And I feel like a really important part of this here is that what you're talking about is a group, what started as a group of women. I think most people on the podcast know this, but for anyone who don't, I'm myself non-binary and queer, and I've been allowed into the holy sanctum, which I've appreciated. This isn't about a bunch of guys like talking about how much they love the body of a woman. This is primarily about women enjoying masculine bodies. Mm-hmm. What's the importance of that for you? Like and especially in terms of that positive feedback you're getting. Talk about some of like where that's coming from.
The importance of the group that we have with the other girls is that is an even more safe space, because we get down and dirty. But it's also something that men have generally been able to do this more. If you look at all the movies of the 80s and 90s, action movies, dramas, you see boobs, like a lot of boobs. It's always about that. And it's not even used to move the plot along. It's for that shock value. Like, oh, this movie might suck, but at least you get to see some boobs. Yeah. And we're not even seeing the parts of, it's just like these guys are doing the Lord's work and working out and, giving us it's hard, but it's nice that we're finally making a space where women feel safe and empowered enough to talk about their sexuality, not specifically, but almost indirectly.
Right.
Through, our conversations, and everybody, it's just a great time, and it's meaningful.
I think that's such an important point. To me, that's one of the first things I really wanted to focus on, because I think sometimes we can have this attitude, and I think we've seen it some post up in this and other conversations of, oh, okay, well, if you can all talk about like Chris Hemsworth like that, does that mean it's okay for us to go back to talking about ScarJo's butt or something like that? Mm-hmm. And I think the context and the power dynamics that we're talking about here are such an important part of these conversations. Mm-hmm. Catherine Ray, who's a panda of great repute and been on been in a number of these conversations, she wrote in some comments that I wanted to read because I think they're so pertinent to what we're talking about right now. I'll mention some other things she wrote in as well later, but she wrote, "Before we have any conversation about thirsting and the ethics of thirst, we have to be on the same page about the society in which we live. It's sexist and racist and ableist and transphobic and heteronormative and. If we're not in agreement about those facts, we can't really move forward. The overall societal power differences between men and women, between straight and gay folks, is extremely real and must be considered. Because there's a fundamental difference between a woman or a queer person being confident and empowered by her sexuality and desires rather than shamed or devalued for them.
I mean, she hits the nail on the head.
Yeah.
And I do feel like I don't want this to sound pretentious, but the way that we have talked about some of the men and women, the men who also post their thirst post, which is awesome, have done it in a way that is kind of mirroring what we're like. We have this, it's like church thirst.
Yeah, there's definitely a kind of like keeping the conversations much more innuendo than direct statements.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting, as you pointed out, that there were some who were bothered by it. And I don't want to make this just about the panda discussion. I think that I've seen this happen in other parts of fandom. And as far as I can tell, that kind of delves into two different directions. And I kind of want to be very clear about how I'm kind of being very respectful towards one and maybe not so much towards another.
Yeah.
The first one being, I think there are people who just don't want that level of conversation about sexuality in some of the media they consume. And I think that is completely reasonable. And I think that I really like the attitude that you all have taken of, you know, the podcasts that you're a part of and some of the other ones you support are going to go more in that direction. But hey, there's a lot of MCU podcasts out there. There's a lot of DC podcasts out there. If people want to find ones that are not delving into the thirst, that's very okay. The second direction, though, and I think you've mentioned this, and it's one I want to kind of dive into further, is the one that I think is much more troubling, where it is part of it is the kind of like, well, but does that mean we can go back to like saying shitty things about women's bodies? But I will get to that, but I think the place to start is those who are, sometimes they'll say this directly, sometimes it's subtle, but it becomes very clear that they're just bothered by the idea that women can be this lustful, you know, in terms of like it not being, and I'm speaking fairly gender essentialist terms because that's the terms of this debate, and I think we're clearly trying to broaden out somewhat, but I love what you were kind of saying there about the importance of it being women being able to say this, and what Catherine was saying as well of, you know, I'll tell a story from my own sake. I mean, I think I came up in a pretty woke kind of background. My mother was very much a feminist. And yet the first time I was hanging out with a bunch of teenagers, more primarily girls, and they were talking about, I forget who it was. I think it was Jordan Catalano, the star of My So-Called Life, who always bothered me because he was very attractive to the people I knew, and I could never brood. I giggle too much. But putting that aside, and the way they were discussing him, you know, in terms like his body or his face and the things they would like to do with him, it shocked me because I had come up in that mind of like, no, guys are into like sexuality and women want like love and romance and stuff like that. Exactly. And that kind of like very gendered nonsense. So I'd love you to say more about like for you, what is it, the kind of positive feedback, what is it you're seeing in terms of the doors this has opened up and why it matters?
It's kind of overwhelming to get the emails where people are, you know, thanking me for speaking up, especially after we brought up on the cast, you know, we don't shy away from the negative feedback on the MCU cast. Like if somebody sends something in, we bring it up and we discuss it. And that negative feedback opens the doors for other people to feel like, oh, well, I also didn't like that. So I'm going to go let them know as well, which is totally fine. And then you'll get a string of those in a row. But then when you bring that up, the amount of people who like reached out to me personally through my Instagram, through my Facebook to be like, you know, please don't stop what you're doing, you know, gay men, you know, women, even straight men, like it was awesome. And it just felt so supported for something that it's a shame that we even have to do this about because it's so natural for men.
Right. Yeah, I think that's such a big part of it, especially with, you know, something that, as Catherine said, that I think is such an important part of the context is none of these things we're talking about are happening in a, you know, like equal power base of gender conversation here. And I think this is such an important thing because, you know, and I think different people can have different opinions on this. And as you said, there started to be some comments in our group and other places of, masculine identified folks, being appreciative of female bodies, but in you can clearly tell that they're being very careful about their words and very careful about the ways they're phrasing it, that it's very much in the appreciation instead of claiming or instead of like what I would do.
Right.
And there's a comment I know that you and I were talking about this earlier that I'd love to hear you get into more of, the power imbalance of, men talking about women's bodies can have a level of threat involved that isn't necessarily there with the kind of thirst you're talking about. Say more about that and how that kind of difference plays out for you.
One feedback, one email that I got that stood out to me a little bit more than the others was a gentleman wrote in and he had a problem with the thirsting, but it was because it reminded him of how he treated women in his past. Right. And at that point, I felt, I had let one of the other hosts kind of respond back to these other things to have the male perspective with my thoughts in it. But this one, I really felt like I need to respond to this because that is not my fault. What someone needs to look at with that kind of assessment of the situation is inner. It's not me. You're putting your past on me and being like, you're making me feel uncomfortable because of the things I used to do. And I will not have someone put that crown upon my head.
So I really like that you brought up this specific example because, and again, like for those of us who have no idea what we're talking about in the panda community, things like this happen in fandom all the time. I've spoken to a number of other women creators or queer creators. They talk about hearing similar things. I think there's a situation that can happen sometimes when people in power, you see this with white folks talking about racial issues, with, straight folks talking about those things, but especially here, men talking about, who gets to appreciate whose bodies and in what language. There's sometimes this feeling of like, well, wait, you can do it, so why can't I? And so the first thing I think is that there's a whole thing of, in that was a case of someone who was basically admitting like, I can't do this responsibly. I don't know how to find the lines of appropriateness. And so not only do I feel like I have to pull back entirely, but that means that everyone else around me should pull back entirely. And that to me is just all kinds of unhealthy projection, because then that's the idea of I get to tell other people what they should think and feel because I can't control myself. Mm-hmm. But the other part there, and this I really want to hear you go more into, is for me, this is getting into the same kind of like equating of these things, that like I used to say sexually harassing things to, I think you were talking about like women who were worked or stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so you talking about your feelings towards a celebrity, that to me is the same thing. And I feel like there's like 3 different levels to unpack there in terms of gender versus in terms of the power dynamics and in terms of the celebrity versus people you know directly. So let's kind of break it down a little bit. Let's just start with gender there. What for you is it of like, what do you makes it different that it's women or queer people or, folks who are not necessarily like masculine identified talking about masculine bodies?
There's always the, when I see Scarlett Johansson or Natalie Portman, like sometimes part of me is like, damn, it's positive. I'm like, I want to get in shape. Like it can be, even when I see like Chris Evans, I'm like, damn, like maybe I could do that. And it would like push me to want to do better with myself, mm-hmm. instead of just stuffing my face with chips and watching all of these rock hard bodies on TV.
I would push back on the idea of that there's anything better about one kind, but I would say like, yeah, it certainly can be a goal, but I want to be very clear about like all kind of bodies can be better or worse or anything like that. But yeah, anyway, go on.
It's just like, like when I personally like things that I see that make it pleasing.
So clearly there's that difference, but then also there's this whole idea of the gender involved, and I think when I hear comments like that person who wrote in or from a lot of others about like, well, if you can do it, we can too. For me, I feel like there's kind of a number of levels that they're not understanding. And one of them is the difference between like of gender and how the gender power dynamics play out in terms of like who is saying what about whom and the level of threat or appreciation that's involved there. A second is in terms of like power dynamics. And then third, connected to that, is the difference of like the way you talk to people in your life, especially in your place of work, versus the way fans talk to each other about celebrities. And let's kind of break those down and go one by one. So first of all, in terms of gender, how do you see it in terms of like women or queer folks or non-masculine folks appreciating male bodies being fundamentally different than the normal discourse of men talking about women's bodies.
There's always been a power dynamic between men and women and physicality of it. Say you are walking to your car at night in an empty parking lot and you're alone. For most men, you just walk to your car. But for like me, I'll stop, I'll look, I'll see what's around, I'll look at the lights, I'll make sure my keys are in my hand in case something happens. And there's a different, it's like a fear dynamic. And it's like what we were talking about with catcalling. You know, if you are a female alone walking down the street and 1 to 3 or more guys start catcalling you, it's fear.
Right.
Whereas if you're a male walking down the road and say a bachelorette party of 11 starts screaming at you, it's funny or annoyance or uncomfortable. And those are very different feelings.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good way of putting it. And like I said, I'm non-binary, but I was socialized as male for most of my life. I'm certainly very masculine presenting. I'm not Chris Hemsworth. I don't get catcalled very often, but I've had the kind of bachelorette party experience a couple of times. And you know, sometimes it's been like, oh, hey, cool. I'm glad people like the way I'm dressed. Mm-hmm. Other times it was, you know, with a lot of alcohol and didn't feel great. And I kind of wanted it to end. I never had a moment of physical fear for my safety. I never had a moment of thinking someone was going to touch me in a way that I don't want to be touched. And to me, I think that is such, you know, and again, we're not talking about this in binary terms. It doesn't mean that like making Chris Hemsworth uncomfortable by tweeting really explicit things is okay.
Exactly.
But it's about that difference of like Chris Hemsworth, Chris Evans probably didn't grow up with the same kind of fears that Natalie Portman or Scarlett Johansson may have. Mm-hmm. Johansson. Names. I'm terrible with names.
It's the best. I love it so much. But yeah, no, it's true. And then so being able to take that sexuality and be confident in yourself and enjoy what's being presented to you very specifically and purposefully. There's no trick behind what's happening on the screen. They look like that for a reason, and it is for us. And they're like, poor Chris Evans, part of the reason he is not Captain America anymore is because he doesn't want to do that. The work, that you have to put into it, eating whole chickens a day, the things you have to do to bulk up like that. Right. It's hard, but it's for a reason. Yeah,
it's hard, and it can be distinctly unhealthy. I mean, there's definitely some people of all genders.
Tom Hardy went through it.
Yeah, Tom Hardy went through it. I think this is less the case now, but certainly in the 80s when the Arnold Schwarzenegger, like today our figures are like ripped and like very muscular. Mm-hmm. But you know, the male action heroes of the 80s and 90s who took their shirts off a lot were more the Schwarzenegger, like super bulked up. Yep. A lot of those actors were taking steroids. And often were feeling like pressured that they had to and things like that. And so I think, again, it's very important to name like the dangers of that kind of thing and the importance of that. But again, like also there, you know, and again, it's such a complex thing to talk about because I'm never trying to minimize that. Right. But it's the sort of like Chris Hemsworth, Chris Evans, there are sexy people besides Chris. Those are the ones that come to mind.
They're
all the
just
time.
Right at the tippity top.
Not mentioning Pratt. But, you know, those men are in now situations where because of the work that they're trying to do and the way that the Hollywood pressures, they're being pushed or maybe they're choosing, whatever it is, but there's certainly a lot of pressure to do unhealthy things.
Right.
But they also didn't grow up in a culture of eating disorders and body pressure because of just being their gender in the way that I think, again, someone like a lot of the female actors may well have.
Right. Like, and what the women have to go through. I remember when Margot Robbie had just done, I think, Suicide Squad. And then there were pictures of her and the news was just tearing her apart. Like, look how fat she looks, let herself go, this and that. But little did they know is she was training, or I call it training, to be Tanya Harding. So she was purposely putting on weight. It's kind of the same thing that they did to Chadwick Boseman when people saw that he was getting skinny. Like, you just look at these pictures that the paparazzi and the news media put out and you make your own narrative based off what they're saying, and it's cruel.
Right. And in Chadwick's case, there have been times where his body weight shifted because of roles, and then, of course, also because of his illness towards the end of his career and the end of his life. But yeah, I think the point's very well taken there. Mm-hmm. And I think kind of what we're getting at here is that's, to me, that element of fear is a big part of it. And to me, that also goes into a lot of the kind of language that's being used. Because one thing I've noticed is that in the kind of thirst comments I hear in Stranded Panda, but also in a lot of the other places where, because again, these conversations are happening in all sorts of media, it's a lot about appreciation. It's a lot about the kind of things that, oh, I'd love it if he did this to me. I'd love to, climb him like a tree, whatever it might be. Yeah, exactly. To me,
Sorry, I was thinking about Michael Fassbender.
Very understandable.
My God.
Totally with you there. But to me, there's also I compare that to the kind of language I heard in locker rooms growing up, or even when I was an adult, where there was a level of violence to the language, where there was a level of oh, if I could take her, if I'm going
to drive her into the ground, stuff like that.
Yeah, whatever it is, or the things that. And I think a part of that is just kind of the language that is used around the way men express their sexuality, the way women express their sexuality. And again, I'm speaking very binary terms. It's not black and white by any means.
We don't help at all when we're break me in half, baby.
No, but that's the thing. To me, there's a big difference between break me in half versus I'm going to break you in half. You know? And and people can enjoy
consent to break me in half.
I'm not saying tops can't be thirsty. Tops can be thirsty too. But it's just it's to me there's such that difference of language, I think, that so often the male language around thirst, there's a threat in it, that there's a power dynamic there. That again, I mean, I'm sure that you can dig up tweets of women saying really atrocious things to male stars without any concept of consent. I'm not saying that that's not the case.
Exactly. And I sometimes enjoy having things like that said to me. Weird things turn you on. It is what it is.
I mean, again, that's why I'm tops get to thirst, and that's an okay statement. I've talked a lot here about that kind of language, but for you, again, what's the kind of, I think we're kind of having all sorts of different ways of talking about the same central idea of the power dynamic of the language. But I guess maybe I would say it is to you, are there kind of lines that you're thinking about subconsciously that even when you're on the cast talking about thirst, that even there you're still wanting not to cross?
So it's different for me. I've grown up watching strong comedian women Chelsea Handler or people like that. And I have done acting and I've done improv. And for me, I have been taught and trained, do not hold back. And that's kind of how I've always been. So this has just always kind of been how I've treated things through my whole life. And it was very interesting to kind of bring that in and kind of be this new little force to be reckoned with. Right. And, I stuck to my guns and I was this is not something that we need to really censor. Because I feel like everything that we do is very PG-13. We're not saying, I can, but I don't.
We're speaking, it's all in euphemism.
Yeah. So I, for myself, can sometimes probably say things a lot more off color than other people and then just breeze right by it because that's just who I am. And I'm going to say what comes to my mind. And sometimes people don't like it and that's fine. And we talk about it and we move on, but it's also there now. And I wasn't afraid and I didn't hold back and I wasn't worried or thinking about, I wonder how people are going to think about what I have to say. I'm just saying what I have to say.
Right. And I think, again, that's where it's so important. Another thing Catherine had written in when she said there is representation also matters. We've seen countless instances of men lusting after women. Let's normalize lusting across the gender and relationship spectrums.
Right.
And I really like that because I do think that there's often this idea of, okay, there's been too, to me, it's again being able to really look at what is important and what matters. And there can be the response to the over-sexualization of women in movies, which is 100% a real problem. The over-tolerance of men sexualizing women, whether it's in the workplace or on screen or whatever it is, it can lead to an idea of, okay, let's just take sex out of it entirely. which is, puritanical and problematic in all the ways, but also, as we keep getting to, it totally negates the idea that lots of people can feel lust other than cis men lusting after cis women. And then also there are ways to express that lust that can be consensual and can be appropriate and still be kind of fun and raunchy.
Yeah. Sex has always sold. This prudist, we as a country are a lot more prude than other countries. I've been, when you go to Paris and you're walking down the street, you see boobs on the magazines at the little bodegas there. It isn't a thing like we have it here. And the sooner we can just stop acting like sexuality and, lust and it's not, I guess, no, wait. The more we stop acting like sexuality is a problem and more part of, your everyday lives. You have your partners, you have people who you love and you experience these things with them. What's a little eye candy before you do it help? I watched Game of Thrones. I watched True Blood. And let me tell you, we had great 8-season, it's just what you don't always, people watch porn.
Yeah.
People don't all have to watch porn. You can get the same kind of turn on from a TV show because it's natural. I don't know. It's hard to dance that line between porn and the Cinemax level of TV and the things that the shock value that, HBO will go for with their sex. Cause sometimes, I'm this does not need to be happening. This scene does not need this.
Right.
They've gotten a lot more explicit with sorry to say a trigger word, but rape scenes and things like that on TV as of late. And it's content that it's polarizing and hard to watch, but it is what happens. And sometimes seeing the brutality of that might be the only thing that might show somebody how awful it can be.
Yeah. And I think that there's definitely, it's kind of like there have been similar conversations about racism in terms of that there was value for there is some value in showing brutality because, to help people understand that, but then also that it can become another kind of porn. It can become
exactly.
Certainly, there's a TV show called Warrior that Paul and I love, and we've talked a little bit about, and we're going to definitely be recording more episodes on. And it does something that Game of Thrones does that I found incredibly problematic in both, which is that it showed sexual violence and was very clearly trying to both show you that it's terrible and bad and brutal and it should be awful, and also make it titillating.
Yeah.
In ways that I think were deeply problematic. And to me, I always think of one of the sort of stellar examples of the exact opposite is the movie Birds of Prey, which, they made very conscious choices of, there are two scenes in particular. This isn't going to be spoilers for Birds of Prey, but maybe mild spoilers. So if you haven't seen it, skip ahead a minute. It's a great movie. Definitely go see it. Mm-hmm. But there's a scene in which one of the women characters is about to be beaten up by a number of men. And it's going to happen. It's going to be terrible. And what you see is that the character kind of disassociates in order to get through it and not, break down. And so the focus is on her disassociation. Mm-hmm. And then there's another scene where a woman is stripped naked because a man wants to show his power over her. And they convey just how horrible the man is, just how upset and upsetting the situation should be, but also have the camera turn away just before you would actually see the woman be disrobed,
mm-hmm.
And to me, I think we're kind of getting off into a different topic here, but it's we talk often about male gaze, female gaze, and that's a very complicated topic that I don't want to get into too much here. But I think Marvel especially has done a lot to try and show these things through the female gaze, and try to make it more about it's, bare-chested men, half-naked men, but not just the gratuitous shot. It's part of establishing shots or showing how a friend of mine pointed out Jessica Plummer, who's been on a constant guest on here. She when I was asking her about this topic, she talked about the first time we see Thor shirtless in the first Thor movie, and that so much of that scene is an appreciation for the audience of Chris Hemsworth half naked, which I appreciate. Though I think his facial hair looks really weird in that movie.
Oh, they bleached it. Oh, it's terrible.
That's what the thing is. Okay.
And his eyebrows are bleached. Oh.
Okay, that's why his face looked weird. But
yeah.
his pecs still look great. But that's so much about that shot is not just, hey, pretty person on screen, but showing Jane Foster appreciating him and showing the way in which he's appreciating him, not just as a body, but as a person. So to me, all that just kind of ties into the ways in which, like, it's not part of the way the fans are talking about it. It's also because the movies, the way they're showing it, is changing somewhat, and that it can be different than like what HBO is doing.
Exactly. Yeah.
The gender thing is obviously a huge part of this, and the differences in with sexualities and genders and all sorts of things like that. Let's segue, though, into the other, I think, important part of this, which is that we're talking to each other as fans about celebrities who are... I mean, I would love it if Chris Hemsworth was listening to our podcast. It's very far removed from that. And you gave that example of the person who was saying that, like, it bothers them because it reminds them of what they did to people in their workplace. And I think such a fundamental difference here is that difference between, how we talk about celebrities to each other versus how we're talking about, people in our own lives. And going back to, again, something Catherine wrote in, she said, getting real specific, me talking about a celebrity, their body, things I would do with them are not reflective of how I would treat that person in real life. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something I've heard you talk about as well. For you, what's that difference there? That the fact that you're talking about someone who's not in the room and not listening and that you're not saying it directly to them. How does that kind of make this feel better for you?
Please. If I met Chris Evans, I probably wouldn't be able to talk, and I would probably curtsy my invisible skirt like, hello, sir. It's kind of the same thing. I call it's like computer balls. When you're behind your computer, by yourself, you get empowered and you say these things. Well, it's the same, like, what's the joke? It's, when that person's walked by, I stop talking. But when they leave, I start talking again. Like, I'm obviously not going to go and be like, yo, Chris Hemsworth, I love them abs. Let me wipe my face all over them. I mean, it depends on how much I've had to drink. Let's be completely honest. I'm not going to say that I wouldn't be the person to go up and say those things to them because I'm actually pretty confident about myself and I wouldn't be worried about it. I think they know. Mm-hmm. But no, the average person, that's not the first thing you're going to say when you meet a celebrity.
Right.
No.
And I think, not drunk shaming. I think that, if Drunk Ashley did that when I was in her company, I might pull her back a little bit. Be like, well, let's let Mr. Chris have his drink.
Yeah, and you'd be like, no, I want to talk to little Chris. He's calling my name.
But I think the point is, like, that whatever the ethics of those choices we're going to make, that to me is still so different than what you're doing on air, because we're talking about it it's fantasy, and
fantasy. Look how much fanfic there is out there.
Right, exactly. And I think that that's such an important thing and I think that's where a lot of people don't understand of drawing the line. Because again, it's I think there's a real danger of thinking that the stuff that we can say to each other, to me, there's two kind of important points here. One is that it's about, we're talking about people, we're not talking to them, we're talking to each other. But also, to me, I think it would also be, like, pretty bad if, like, me and two other coworkers were talking about all the things we wanted to do with a third coworker. Like, that is also, like, a deeply uncomfortable situation. And it's not, again, that celebrities are, like, untouchable. Like, I think, again, it can be problematic. But the fact that it's talking about fantasy and it's talking about something so far out of the realm of reality that it becomes kind of a safe place to express those thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Perfectly said. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what we've created a little bit. People have grown more comfortable with joining in the conversation and, saying what's on their mind. And that's all we could ever ask for.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a good thing. I think, I talked before about how there can be this kind of, well, sexuality is used in these bad ways, and so let's cut out sexuality entirely, and that's just as problematic. And now there's sort of a, like, in different parts of our world, we're more and more sort of saying, okay, let's bring sexuality back into here and bring sexuality back into here and say, like, can there be, there's HBO nudity, but there can also be awesome nudity, and some HBO shows have used nudity in great ways. Like, I'm not saying that that's not the case. But I think that what it also brings up there is that a lot of what, and I hear you talking about, like, I when I asked you about the kind of lines that you don't cross, I think so much, you're right, it is about your confidence, it is about those things, but it does feel like there's still lines of appropriateness that I'm from all the things I've listened to, I can tell there are lines that you're not crossing. And that when you have had people in the groups cross them, there's an understanding of like, we're starting to play in new waters and it can be difficult for some people, but it's still important to understand this doesn't mean everything goes again, and that there is still those lines of appropriateness that we have to be able to respect, partially just, the reading the room and listening to others, but also just an understanding of like, hey, if we get to a point where it makes people uncomfortable, that's something to pay attention to.
Right. And that's the most important thing. When people feel like they're being attacked or this and that, when somebody, mostly if a woman corrects a man on it, then it's they're being attacked instead of, it could be a 1-2 minute conversation of just, I'm not trying to write a script for anybody, but just acknowledging it. You can disagree with it, but being able to acknowledge, like, I didn't realize that made you feel this way or uncomfortable, and then moving past it. The moving past it is the biggest part, because nobody's trying to police or tell everybody this. But when things become problematic, joking about sexual harassment, joking about anything like that off color, be more receptive to a safe community. You are in a safe space, and we're just trying to. I am just trying to be like, hey, this might be a little problematic, and I just want you to know that.
Right.
Be receptive. Yeah. It's not an attack.
Yeah. And I think being able to open to those conversations, as well as just open to the idea of that this is much more nuanced than people think. And I'm so glad that you and some of the other people who wrote in are talking about these power dynamics, because it's funny. The whole saying about like punching up and punching down? I feel like we can kind of say like there's a difference between thirsting up and thirsting down. In the same kind of way of like, one woman I talked to, as I was like preparing to get into this topic and really wanted to hear a lot of different people's perspectives, one thing she said is that she, as a white woman, would be a lot more careful in how she discussed her thirst for a black man's body, just because of kind of being recognizing of the power dynamics about white women and black men, and like all the different like, just because of the long, complicated, and very problematic history that often go along with kind of the sexualization of black male bodies for white women's enjoyment and things like that. And so I think, is that kind of thing that you're also thinking about sometimes? Not necessarily that example necessarily, but just in terms of like recognizing the power dynamics of the different kind of thirst you're talking about.
It'll sound bad. Personally, I don't. I probably should, but I feel like not too long ago to the crew, we were talking about our guys, and I said I would want to climb that mountain that is M'Baku. And it's not, I guess that when I'm in thirst mode, I'm not exactly thinking about that. I don't know how to say this and not sound like a dick, because that's not something I think about.
Right. No, and that's fair. And I think that's just I'm just sort of bringing it up as kind of one other dynamic I think that can be important. I was part of
I think talking about it more publicly, possibly, but I also would worry about white women being afraid to publicly say that they're thirsting after black men. Stop being afraid of that and let that thirst flow.
Yeah. And I think, to be clear, the person I was talking to, I don't think was saying not to say it, but just to kind of have that awareness of that power dynamic in mind, because I think you're right. I mean, M'Baku's a gorgeous, gorgeous man. I will definitely agree with those statements as well.
That's my favorite.
I like a thick daddy figure.
Yeah.
Wow, people are learning a lot about me as well on this podcast.
It's a learning experience. But yeah, I mean, you would think that there'd be that dynamic of people being worried about thirsting over a certain person because they would be worried about somebody being like, ugh, or judging them for it. Because I remember I came out the gate real hard about Zemo in the beginning. I was like, damn, and he's got a plane. And at first people were like, I don't see it. But by like 2 episodes in, a lot more people were on that Zemo train. Yeah, you just got to open up the thirst doors.
And I think that's another fun way of looking at it, because I'm also very much on that Zemo train. I have no idea what his chest looks like. And I think that's one thing, kind of another fun part of this is that the thirst isn't just about bodies. It is about like the characters can be, for Zemo, it's the confidence, it's the scheming, it's the idea that like he's always going to be one step ahead of you, and all the things that implies.
Sexy brain, attracted to smart guys, and talented, like Jack White. Like Ken's like, I don't get it. I'm like, I don't know why, because you play guitar and you know that he's a god. He's like, well, he's weird looking. I'm like, that's part of it. look at it. And then he's got all this talent, and I just would melt in front of him.
Right.
These people just have, there's a reason that these people are stars. There's an electricity about them. You're attracted to them.
Yeah. I mean, charisma can be a lot more than, it's funny because you talk about Jack White. To me, I think it's kind of hilarious that the first person I would think of is Jack Black. Jack Black to me is like the patron saint of dad bod attractiveness. He's put out videos. I have a little bit of a gut. He does as well. And when he puts out a video of him in his underwear being sexy, and people are like all over it,
confident.
I love that. And and to me, that's kind of a good segue into the kind of the last thing I wanted to touch on was, and we've kind of both brought it up a little bit, but just this idea of how, in the same way that like when everyone is thirsting like crazy over, the hot woman's body, and like what is that saying to everyone else who doesn't have that body and can't ever, I love that when Kumail Nanjiani posted pictures of himself looking really well built for the
Ripped.
Eternals, one of the first things he then said is, I didn't get this by hard work. I got this by hard work and a personal trainer and the financial ability to spend 8 hours a day working on my body and a personal chef and all these things.
It's your job when you're a star.
Right. Like, and we can talk about like the problematicness about like, should that be someone's job and things like that.
Judy Garland.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, like, yeah, definitely like some men, but certainly many women have had their lives destroyed by, getting addicted to drugs or, diet pills or things like that. Mm-hmm. Where for you does that stand? Because we're definitely enjoying the way people look, knowing that sometimes what they have to do to look that way isn't the best for them.
It's kind of like I find myself when I'm watching figure skating. Mm-hmm. When someone is out there doing an amazing triple axel and they trip, and I'm like, you trip while I'm sitting there shoving food in my face. Like, you're doing all that, and sometimes I feel like I don't have to. You know what I mean? Like, it's a dynamic, for sure. But you can, as long as you know that the work you would have to do to do that, working out 2 or 3 times a day, personal training, making all your food, unless you're extremely wealthy or an actor, that is not happening. Yeah. So you can choose to be motivated by it or inspired by it, or you can choose to look at it and enjoy it.
Yeah. And I think that's very true. And I think also here, this is where the gender dynamic plays in, because it is definitely true. Like every now and then, like I would love it if people talked about, I'm non-binary, but my body is, I was assigned masculine at birth. I have a, masculine presenting like look, a beard, a masculine body in that regard. And there are times I look at Chris, who's a sexy star who's not named Chris? There's got to be one out there. I just can't think of any at the moment. Stan Sebastian. I look at the way people talk about Stan Sebastian with his shirt off, and like,
Sebastian Stan, you're so cute.
Oh my god, Sebastian Stan with his shirt off, and I wish that it'd be great to be talked about like that. Mm-hmm. But I have never for a moment thought that if I don't have a body like that, then I won't be found attractive. The way I know can very much be true in terms of, like, you look at, again, eating disorder culture and, like, all that kind of stuff of, like, the constant message that unless you're this size 2 waist or whatever, that you can't be attractive. And that fact, as well as the fact that, like, to me, it is so much easier to be a male actor and get all sorts of parts without ever taking your shirt off. I don't love that people are hurting themselves to look good, and I would rather they not have to. But I also don't, like, I don't have any feeling like that you have to do that to be a male actor in Hollywood. Does that make sense?
I feel like it might be, it does. Mm-hmm. If you talking about 80s movies going back, there was a movie Reanimator, and I wish I could remember the actress's name. She's fabulous. But there was a documentary I watched recently where she was one of the females back then who would take her shirt off. Right. And you just had to get used with that, being naked and not caring about it. Because if you didn't do that, you were not getting the roles. Right. And that she got all the roles in the 80s horror movies. She was in dozens of them because she was willing to strip, all the way down full Monty. Mm-hmm. How looking at how men looked in the 90s versus how they look now, it's kind of, we call it being in Marvel shape. You know, when you get that movie, even if you have that Chris Pratt, Parks and Rec dad bod, like, by the time you're going into this movie, you're going to look like that. So I don't know if it's as needed, because they're going to turn you into it.
Well, I guess my point more is if you're starring in the action movie, you have to have that body.
Yeah, you have to. So, like you're going to get that workout. Like you don't have a choice. It's kind of like how women can't be over a certain weight to be a rockette. It's kind of messed up.
Right. Well, but I think my point was that, yes, if you want to be in a Marvel movie, you have to do that. But you can still be an Adam Sandler. You can still be a Jack Black. There are still so many ways in which a male actor can be incredibly famous and popular without ever taking their shirt off or without ever having to even have the suggestion of that kind of body, in a way that like is changing, but certainly for women actors has not been the case. That like if you're the woman in an Adam Sandler movie, you still have to look damn good.
You have to be Kate
probably.
Beckinsale. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's kind of my point, is that I feel like, Scarlett Johansson looks great. Natalie Portman looked great. But I feel like that I hate the fact that they have to look like that to be in any movie where they're a romantic character, in a way that like isn't necessarily true for the male actor. And that's why, like, to me, so it can feel more like a choice for someone in a Marvel movie.
Well, then I feel vice versa to you about how you were saying, like, I've never seen that and felt like I needed to look like that to be attractive, because as a woman, I constantly feel like that.
Exactly.
And it's a struggle, and I go through it a lot. And for these ladies, you see like a Rebel Wilson or Melissa McCarthy, and, they started their career being heavier, and they have lost, Adele, they've lost amazing amounts of weight. And I'm like, proud of them. But was that them, or was that the Hollywood influence?
Right.
It's hard to tell. You don't know them to talk to them about it, but, Hollywood's Hollywood.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the point, is I feel like there are particular doors that open for a man if you have the Marvel body, but there's a lot of doors that you can get into without, that you can't necessarily on other points of the gender spectrum and things like that.
Exactly.
Well, I think that kind of hits a lot of the points that I wanted to bring up. I want to say, because this is a topic that so many people in our community have been caring about, we kind of threw open the doors. Catherine had a lot of things to say. We kind of invited some other people to be on as hosts as well. I really wanted to hear from you specifically, but I think there were some people who decided not to, which I think is great, because I think you've been such a great presence on this, as well as just, the fairy godmother of thirst.
I do feel like I've been rambling a little bit. It's hard. It's a hard thing to dance around, and that's just kind of showing how careful we are being about it here and on the like we do hear you guys. We are taking the steps to make everybody comfortable, and just know we hear you. We're dancing. We hear it.
Well, I think what's important there is that we're dancing, we're hearing, but we're also, like, you're dancing in completely new territory. Mm-hmm. I have 30 years of history of watching men be terrible at expressing their attractiveness and learning from that, and, trying to be better and figuring this out. As you said, this generation of women, it's not completely new. There's always been some element of it, but we're seeing it in completely new ways, and much more so. And I think part of that is that this is new territory, and there's going to be times where, like, maybe lines get crossed and things like that, and that's okay, because it's. I was really struck by what you said about feeling like you were held back, or that so many people feel held back for so long. And this attitude of, like, yeah, we're going to push forward, and maybe a line will be crossed, and we'll learn, and we'll do better. Mm-hmm. But that's so much better, as you said, to, as you said, like the idea that because a line could be, because this could be hard new territory for women expressing thirst, therefore you shouldn't go there at all.
I'll take us right across that line.
Yeah. And then we listen, and we learn, and we figure it out, and we realize that sometimes people are bothered, and that's a reason to slow down, and sometimes people are bothered, and it's like, well, that's some of your own stuff you got to deal with.
Right.
So as I said, like, we got a lot of great feedback and comments from people. Another person who's been very active in the Panda world, Melissa Khalil, wrote, I appreciate that you, Ashley, and the Panda community have given women a platform to express their attraction to celebrities without feeling judgment. Because historically, women are looked down upon for expressing their thirst for good-looking men, but it's always been accepted for men to openly express their thoughts on physically attractive women. I think this is an important conversation to have, because often women are slut-shamed for commenting on men that they're physically attractive, and having a platform where women can feel comfortable and not judged for talking about these completely normal human feelings is awesome, as a big step towards gender equality.
Oh, thanks, Melissa.
Yeah.
And she's right.
Yeah. And it's funny, we hadn't brought it up, but I think it's one more aspect to this, the idea of slut-shaming. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it. Like, I think that there's a sense of, it's normal for guys to feel like lust and attraction, but if a woman does, well, women are supposed to be demure and pure, and you're supposed to like caregivers, not the sexy chest, and you're supposed to want to have, you're supposed to dream about the nice wedding and not the wedding night. And so I love that she's bringing up that point about like it's a way of fighting that slut shaming as well.
And that is something that, being a very vocal woman, I've had to deal with a lot because, from thirst to just being outspoken with your thoughts, oh, you're a bitch, you're a slut, or this or that. And being able to have someone say that to you and not back down and not cower away is very important, because don't let them create a narrative for your, they don't know you and they don't know anything about you. So stand to your guns, slut shaming, it's something men created.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it's because,
and I don't want to talk about Trump, but I do just
go for it.
The way that he can say that, saying something like grab him by the pussy is a locker room talk.
Yeah.
Saying the things that we say in our thirst doesn't even hold a candle to the context of the way he said what he was saying. And that was taken by everyone. Oh, well, it's just locker room talk. But yet, if I was like, oh, I want to go up and grab his, caca, they'd be like, oh, it's slut shaming.
Yeah. I think that's so true. And I think that kind of speaks to what I was talking before about how often the masculine language around thirst is so much more like violent and possessive. Not by any means all. And I love seeing more masculine men. I love seeing more masculine presenting folks finding language to talk about their appreciation and being turned on by seeing someone without it being that grab them language. But I think Trump's a perfect example of exactly what I'm talking about. And when he said it's just locker room talk, that's outrageous because it's like, it is so horrible. But when he says it's locker room talk, unfortunately, he's right. I mean, I did hear that kind of language in locker rooms all the time when I was growing up,
And that is in society just okay for the boys.
Right.
Yeah. Not anymore, boys.
Yeah. I love that. Well, I love how outspoken you are about this. I love your perspective. I'm so glad you got to be on this. And so let me kind of just end with there. Like, what's the kind of last things you want to leave people with in terms of why this is important, why this matters, and why you're enjoying it?
It's more like, be more accepting of things that make you uncomfortable. Be more understanding, be more open and willing to receive things that make you uncomfortable. And your life will become such a more enriched place because it's fun out there and it's also terrible out there. And these little glimmers and these moments where you just get to shut out the world and talk to your girlfriends and your guy friends, because the fact that men now post pictures of hot guys and hashtag it thirst crew alert makes me so happy, because it just shows like even, the cis man can acknowledge that this guy is attractive and he doesn't feel threatened by it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, it totally does. And I think you're right, because it is both coming from queer men in the group, but also from cis het men who are just appreciating. And it's funny, I mean, I say that and I hear a million people saying, are they just appreciating or is there something secret there? I think both are true, but I do think I think part of what we're getting to is this idea of being, and here's maybe even taking it one step further, of like that you can just say, I'm not sexually attracted to that body, but I can acknowledge it's gorgeous and the person there is beautiful and very sexy. And I think that's, one more step of this. And
I have a great example when you're done your point. Sorry.
Sure. There's a different point I was going to make. So you go ahead and give your example and then I'll make my last point and then we can wrap up.
When I had told Ken that, Ken obviously knew my husband, that we were coming on here, we were watching the Friends reunion and David Beckham popped up and he goes, see, right there. That is an example of a good looking man. He's not, not too soft and feminine. He has that look, but it's not too much. He's got that hard look, but it's not too much. That is a very good looking man. And I was like, babe, aw. And we can have those conversations.
For sure.
And it's fantastic.
And yeah, that's great. And I will say, I love a feminine looking man. I mean, that's, Ken has one particular taste. I want to make sure that's not the only.
He likes it right in the middle.
Yeah, all good there. The other thing I was going to say, just as part of that, is, And I think the work that you all have doing, when, cis women talking about their thirst, I think has knocked down a lot of walls. And the fact that now also a lot of queer people are talking about that stuff. If you had told me 10 years ago that I would be producing content for a geek audience, and that I would also be able to openly talk about being trans and being queer and about my attraction to male bodies, I would have laughed you out of the room. I spent time in queer spaces and I spent time in comic book spaces when I was in high school. And I know there's a lot of, there is a lot of overlap between those two communities, but there's also a lot of overlap that isn't there, and when I was in high school, those two were very far apart communities. And I think something that's really beautiful that's happening in, like, we often talk about how toxic fandom can be, and it is, and it's terrible, and it has to be fought. But there's an awful lot of queer fandom being built. There's often a lot of queer-friendly fandom being built. There's a lot of fandom being built that is, with women expressing thirst and men being able to talk about this stuff and non-binary people being able to just plant their flag where they need to and all of this. Like, to me, it is something... it's funny because I know it's kind of like how we're talking about like how Doritos can change the world. A lot of the thirst I know you talk about, it's fun. It's girl talk. It's all of us just kind of chatting, sending pictures back and forth, and it's fun. But I think it really is making good changes that are super important. And for myself, I feel like you being really the leader on this, and then other women joining in, and then other queer people like myself being able to join in. It made that community, it made fandom a lot safer for me. And so for that alone, I'm grateful.
It's amazing. It's overwhelming.
Oh, good.
It's good. It's good.
well, now that I've gotten you all verklempt, why don't you talk to us more about where people can find your other places where you talk about thirst and other topics online.
Always join us on the Stranded Panda Facebook chat and post whatever you want. If you summon the thirst fairy godmother, she will appear. So you can at me anything you want to talk about. Trivia, as always, Wednesdays on Twitch, Stranded Panda TV / Twitch or whatever. And we do your feedbacks on Monday, and Loki's starting up real soon. So we're going to be doing live casts of Loki on Wednesday evenings, I believe, live watch and then an instant feedback. And that will bleed right into Twitch. Check back on our newsletter and pages for times.
All that's on the MCU podcast, and everything we're talking about is on the Stranded Panda podcast network. And there, if you go to strandedpanda.com, you can find all the information about that podcast, as well as other podcasts on Star Wars, which I run, podcast on Star Trek, podcasts on Animation Deliberation, which my Star Wars podcast, I'm doing a great partnership with them on The Bad Batch. There's all sorts of great podcasts there. Check that out. You can find Ashley's contact information there. And if you want to give feedback for this episode specifically, as I said, we got into a lot of difficult topics. There might be a lot of things that people are like, I don't love the way you said that from any direction. We may agree.
Which is fair.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've been speaking pretty, I made a comment earlier about how, that we want to be careful that, like, not everyone has desires, and that, people on a spectrum or just any other perspective may not feel this kind of thirst, and that's completely okay. I also may recognize we then did a whole episode on thirst, and maybe, some folks from that direction were not happy with it, or whatever it is, let us know what you think. We'd love to hear that feedback. We'd love to talk about it more. You can find my contact information on theethicalpanda.com, or just by searching for Ethical Panda on Facebook or Twitter. You can also email me at theethicalpanda@gmail.com. I'll also say we've gotten some great feedback on a couple of other issues, including a really good point about something I missed. Then we were talking about Invincible, that I'm going to get to at a later episode. I want to kind of let this one just be itself. But please give us feedback on this, any other questions you've got. I also got some great feedback recently on another topic. We may even just do a full feedback episode because so much of it has been coming in. So thank you all so much for being listeners. Ashley, thank you so much for being a part of this great conversation, and have a great day.
Thanks for having me. What a good idea.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.